Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Panos Dafas, President of the Macedonian Society of Great Britain, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our live webinar tonight. Before we start with today's event, allow me to first say a few words about our society. The Macedonian Society of Great Britain was founded in London, 1989, by members of the Greek community in the UK. We are a registered UK charity and a member society of the Hellenic Centre in London. The primary aim of the society is the promotion of the Hellenic history, tradition, and culture of Macedonia. We are the main organization in the UK that educates and reminds the public with lectures, seminars, and other events that Macedonia's cultural heritage is Hellenic. Today's event is about the Greek Revolution in 1821 in Macedonia, and we have invited basically the Society for Macedonian Studies to present some of their original work on this topic for today's seminar. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Vasilios Papas, the president of the Society for Macedonian Studies, couldn't make it today, but Professor Iakovos Michailidis, who will open the seminar, will read a message by Dr. Papas. So allow me first to introduce Professor Michailidis to you. Iakovos Michailidis is currently a professor of modern and contemporary history at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. In the academic year of 2012 to 2013, he served as a visiting professor at the University of Cyprus. In the 2019 to 2020 academic year, he received a scholarship from the Fulbright Foundation and was a visiting researcher at George Washington University. In the same year, he was an academic visitor at the University of Oxford. He has worked as an expert for the Western Balkans on the Economic and Social Committee of the European Union. He is the head of the Research Center of the Society for Macedonian Studies and a member of many Greek and European scientific networks and organizations, such as the European Thematic History Network, CLIONet. Professor Michailidis was a historical consultant for various TV programs in Greece and edited the historical tributes of Sky 100.3 radio on the subjects of Balkan Wars, the Asia Minor Campaign, Eleftherios Venizelos, the occupation, and the Civil War. Dr. Iakovos Michailidis and the rest of the panel will answer questions at the end of the presentation. But please submit your questions at any point during the webinar using the Q&A panel, which you can find actually on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. I think that's all from me. So without further ado, I'll give you Professor Iakovos Michailidis and the team.
Thank you, Panos. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, indeed, the Macedonian Society of Great Britain for the invitation. Actually, it's a great pleasure for us. As Panos already mentioned, the president of the Society for Macedonian Studies in Thessaloniki, he was unable to join us. Unfortunately, he was obliged to move in Athens, but he sent me a few sentences, and I'm gonna read them. Ladies and gentlemen, as president of the Society for Macedonian Studies, I welcome today's event and warmly thank the Macedonian Society of Great Britain for its initiative. The Society for Macedonian Studies, faithful to its statutory goals, has been studying and promoting the history of Macedonia for more than 80 years. In this context, a group of young researchers, you can see them, founded by the Society for Macedonian Studies, implemented a research program for the reflection of the Macedonian Revolution of 1821 in the international press. The conclusions of the research will be published. I would like to assure you that the Society for Macedonian Studies will continue to serve Macedonia and highlight its history. In a few weeks, the events dedicated to the centennial anniversary of the Asia Minor catastrophe and the settlement of refugees in Greece, and especially in Macedonia, will begin. I hope that we will have the pleasure to share with you in the nearer future the conclusions of our actions concerning the refugee issue. I send you my best wishes, and I would like you to know that we will always be by your side. So this was the message by Dr. Vasilios Papas, the president for Macedonian Studies, and we are glad to join you this afternoon. Actually, we have 3 young researchers, members of the Society for Macedonian Studies in Thessaloniki, Alexandra Perkanido, Dimitrios Mitsopoulos, and Nikolaos Misolidis. Both are working at the research center of the Macedonian Society in Thessaloniki, and in the last 3 years, they started the research on the topic of the reflection of the Macedonian Revolution in 1821, 1822 in the international press. So today we have the opportunity to share with you the let's say actually the results, some points from the research, and then we will be open to answer any questions by you. We start with Nikos Misolidis, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Peloponnese, and he's for the last 6 years a researcher at the research center of the Society for Macedonian Studies. Every speaker has approximately 15 minutes, and I'm sure that they will go forward and starting with Nikos, and they keep on time. So Nikos.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, I would like to thank the Macedonian Society of the Great Britain for the honor to be here to present our results of our research project. And my topic is about the presentation of the Greek Revolution of 1821 in Macedonia through the press of the United States of America. Let's start with the topic why the American press is so important in spreading the Greek fire. The Greek fire is the name of the Greek Philhellenism, the American Philhellenism in the United States. The role of the American press during the Greek Revolution of 1821 in shaping the image of the Greeks in the United States and the development of Philhellenic movement there was crucial. The publication of Philhellenic texts, such as the poems and the texts by the British poet Lord Byron, whose fame had crossed the Atlantic and flooded the United States after Europe, and the fiery poems by the American poet James Gate Percival, who was urging the Greeks to shake off the barbaric Turkish yoke, invoked the affinity and the sympathy of the American society for the Greek struggle. For example, one of the most prominent Philhellenes who traveled and worked in the revolutionary Greece, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, wrote in his memoirs that one of the main reasons why he decided to support Greek struggle was his love for the Lord Byron's poetry. The popular British poet works marked Howe's later course and gave birth to his need to visit Byron's Greece. At the same time, the huge volume of publication about what was happening. Excuse me, I forgot to share my presentation. I hope you see it.
Yes, Nikos, go ahead.
Thank you. At the same time, the huge volume of publication about what was happening in Greece, the publication of letters by prominent Americans who traveled to the revolutionary Greece in order to help the Greek struggle, as George Jarvis, the first American Philhellene to take part in the revolution of 1821, the Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe to provide rich humanitarian aid to the country, and the American-British war veteran Beckman Miller, who fought in series of battles against the Turkish forces and fueled and augmented the Philhellenic current in the United States in the early years of the revolution. The Greek fire, as the Philhellenic movement of the time was called, was spreading like a wildfire in the United States, as the publisher of the Boston newspaper, The Farmer's Cabinet in the Amherst area, aptly observed in his article. The rapid development of the Philhellenic movement in the United States also led to the creation of the Philhellenic committees in various cities, which aimed to promote the Greek question and provide assistance to the struggling Greeks. Typical examples of the aforementioned committees were those. The PDF was not moving. Okay. Typical examples of the aforementioned committees were those of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, the three cities that were the most important centers of American Philhellenism in the United States. These committees raised money and supplies for their mission to Greece while promoting the Philhellenic publication in the American press in order to further raise awareness of the American public regarding the Greek Revolution. The actual goal of the American Philhellenic committees was organized respectively with the Philhellenic committees of London and Paris in Europe, was to put pressure to the American administration to formally intervene in the Greek question, recognizing the Greeks as embattled and providing assistance to the revolutionaries. With Edward Everett, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay at the helm, the issue of providing aid to the Greek revolutionaries reached as far as Congress. Actually, the debate on the Greek question in the House of Representatives began on the December 7th of 1823, with an introduction of the issue by Daniel Webster, and occupied the House for about a month. The final speech of the American Philhellenic Daniel Webster on the January 19th of 1824 went down in US parliamentary history as a commemoration of the deposition of the liberal values of the American Republic and its obligation to help the Greeks who were fighting for the freedom. However, the declaration of non-interference in the affairs of the old world by the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe, on the December 2nd of 1823, the well-known Monroe Doctrine, combined with the ambition of US business circles to expand American trade in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire, held the official US administration back from an open and practical intervention in the favor of Greece. That move provoked a strong reaction from the American press in those states where the strong pro-Greek committees were operating. But what were the elements that caused the Philhellenic fever in the United States and motivating the American press to try to cover the events that took place in the area thousands of miles off the east coast of the United States? The answer to this question will also help in understanding the events that were projected in the American press regarding the course of the revolution in Macedonia and the peculiarities of this news in relation to those presented by the Central Theater of Greece of the Greek independence war, the southern Greece. The American interest in the Greek Revolution is due to a combination of causes, which are related to the character of the new established American Republic. The development of the classicism movement in the United States at that time, and the influence of this movement to the country elites was one of the main reasons for the fervent support of the Greek Revolution in the American society. At the time of the Greek Revolution in the United States is experiencing a mention above a flourishing of Greek letters. Chairs of Greek studies are established in the colleges of country, correspondingly in Boston, in the capital, Washington, and in Philadelphia. Buildings are being erected in neoclassical style. In fact, in Philadelphia, the neoclassical rhythm of public building was so intense that the city was described as the Athens of the United States. The American citizens came in direct contact with classical Greece from the very environment in which he lived, since the newspapers and the book he reads and the building he saw had references to the ancient Greece. When he was informed that Greeks, the ancient Greeks' modern descendants, had revolted against the infidel tyrant, it was natural for him, the American citizen, to join the struggle of Pericles, Leonidas, and Alexander the Great descendants. The result of these events was the publication of reports calling on the Greeks to liberate themselves from the Turks, who paralleled to the Persians and drive them to Asia, imitating the Alexander the Great. At the same time, the Americans were ardent supporters of the revolutionary movement, both in American continent and in Europe, and those liberal revolutionary movements turned against the conservative regressions of the old continent. After all, the Americans themselves have claimed their independence from a conservative power in Europe, Great Britain, 50 years earlier. However, the special feature of Greek revolution in comparison with the rest of its contemporary revolutionary movement was the fact that Greeks fought not only for the liberation of their homeland, but also for their Christian faith against a Muslim tyrant. As a result, Greek national liberation wars appeared in the American press as a kind of holy war against the Muslims who oppressed the Christians. This last feature appears strongly in the reports on the course of the revolution in Macedonia. The retaliation of the Turks against the Christians in the region of central Macedonia, the destruction of dozens of villages in Chalkidiki, the massacres of the Greeks in Thessaloniki, as well as the subsequent destruction of Nausa by the Turkish forces, appear in a series of American press articles which emphasize the barbaric treatment of civilians by the Turks and the sale of women and children from their martyrdom areas to the slave market. Actually, in reports in the American press, the Philhellenic committees call for fundraisers to send humanitarian aid to the Greeks and rescue the orphans and women from the slave market of Thessaloniki, Smyrna, and Constantinople itself, where the Greeks from Macedonia were transported as spoils of war. At this point, the peculiarities of publication concerning the revolution of Macedonia should be emphasized in comparison with the publications that referred to the revolution in the southern Greek and the Aegean island. Firstly, the vast majority of the news related to the events of revolution in Macedonia were republished by British and French newspapers. The latter were a key source of information on development regarding the Greek Revolution. Not only did they follow what was happening from much shorter distance than in the United States, but also both London and Paris were the most important center of European Philhellenism. Moreover, it should be emphasized that French Mediterranean port of Marseille became the place of sending European aid to the Greek revolutionaries. Therefore, Marseille became one of the places where the news from the revolutionary Greece arrived. Nevertheless, regarding the case of Macedonia, this source of information was the only one for the American publishers. The short duration of the revolution did not allow the American Philhellenes to visit the region, in contrast with the southern Greece, where, as we have mentioned, American has been operating since 1823. Supplying the American press with letters about the situation in southern Greece and the course of revolution there. Therefore, in many cases, apart from the time lag between the event described and its publication, which is perfectly justified considering that in ideal condition, a ship could travel from the East Mediterranean to the east coast of the United States in the time of 6 weeks, the lack of information led to the publisher or the columnist to a misrepresentation of the facts. In general, in case of Macedonia, the articles published in the American press disparaged the Turkish barbarism while hailing the Greek victories, which were reflected as aforementioned with a characteristic delay. When on the battlefield, the scale is tipped in favor of the Turkish forces. A typical example is the issue of Hillsborough Recorder on December 5th in 1821. Hillsborough Recorder was a North Carolina newspaper. and it published a response from London, and he informed us that letters has arrived, quoting, letters has arrived from the trading houses of London, where the information of a victory of the Greeks and the Thessalonians against an army under the administration of Passav Thessaloniki seems to be confirmed. The battle, which appeared to have been bloody, took place in the area of Cassandra. All the monks of Mount Athos participated, carrying crosses and inspiring revolutionaries with their voices and gestures. The Turks were utterly defeated. In another article on the outbreak of the Greek Revolution in Macedonia, the Western Carolina, on the issue of January 1st, 1822, emphasized the sanctity of the character of the revolution against the Turk and the church's contribution to it. This was the slogan for the beginning of the revolution in this rich region, which broke out on June 20th on the three peninsulas. The three peninsulas of Cassandra, Toroni, and Mount Athos, which joined the hinterland in Thessaloniki, contained 80 towns and cities and villages and monasteries, which the Bishop of Ierissos, Adrameri, and Cassandria, and the monks of Mount Athos have a great power, influence, and have significant personal involvement. That's why, when on the day of the revolution, the monks called the people to arms, revolution became complete. The monks were armed with weapons, ammunition, and pistols, and already on June 25th, Thessaloniki was surrounded by bishops, monks, and Thessalian leaders, while at the same time, the Kyklades fleet was stationed near the port. The invocation of religious sentiment was not accidental, as it was one of the hallmarks of the American philhellenism. The Greek War was not just another liberation struggle against tyranny, but also a battle for the survival of Christians in the region against the Muslims. This feature could further motivate US public opinion in favor of the Greek struggle, and was a way out for the Philhellenic committees after the imposition of the Monroe Doctrine and the expulsion of a possible official US intervention in the Greek West. The latter, through the missionary organization, and referring to the religious character of the Greek struggle, collected sums of money and supplies that were sent to Greece. While there was also interest in rescuing many orphans from the struggle, whom they transported to the United States, where they provided them with a high level of education. Many of those orphans distinguished themselves in the political and social life of the United States, while also being the leaven of the Greek community on the other side of the Atlantic. In these articles, which exposed the barbarity of the Turks against the Christians, as well as the description of the Turkish retaliation against the Greeks in Macedonia, also helped. A leading role in this description is played by Thessaloniki, which became the center of the martyrdom of tens of thousands of Christian civilians. A typical example of such publication is the article of the famous New York newspaper Evening Post, which was published in the August 1st of 1823. Quoting, "The situation of the Greeks in Thessaloniki is really deplorable. Passav has ordered deep trenches to be dug for the condemnation of Greeks, Jews, and even Turks who were considered friendly to the Greek independence and who could be sentenced to death and executed overnight. Barbarities like this do not fail to increase the enemies of the gate, and they increase the fighters of the Greeks among those who never thought to resisting against the Turks." Another New York newspaper, Long Island Star, in its issue on February 14th of 1822, wrote an article about atrocities of the Turks in the region of Chalkidiki and Thessaloniki. The Greeks, it is mentioned on the date from Crete, November 3rd, that the Greeks occupy the whole countryside here. the troops had been confined to a few places where they are dying of hunger. On the 12th of November, Cassandra fell to the Turks. Abu Labud, who led the attack, killed 18 rebels himself and received a great prize. The number of prisoners who fell into his hand is said to be large, including 10,000 women, 4,000 of whom arrived in Thessaloniki and were sold to the highest bidder. Abu Labud is said to have moved immediately to Sicya and Mount Athos, places which were supposed to have the same fate as Cassandra. It is said that the Turks had taken 30 Greek ships and transported them to Constantinople. And passing to the point of Sarajevo, 3 or 4 Greeks hung on the side of its ships. Kapoudan Pasha had hung 75 corpses on the side of his ship, which belonged to his Greek sailors, whom he had hung as a symbol of his victory upon his arrival in the Dardanelles. Across the same lines moved the February 20th of 1822 issue of the Pennsylvania newspaper Gettysburg Complier, which referred to the massacre carried out by the Pasha of Thessaloniki, Mehmet Emin, known as Abu Labud, the Butter, and the economic blattering he imposed on the Greek community of Thessaloniki. This article states characteristically, on the 12th of November, the Turks managed to capture Cassandria. Abu Labud Pasha, who led the attack, he killed himself 18th labor. Many women fell into the hands of the Turks, 4,000 of whom were sold to the highest bidder. In fact, 4 years later, on the issue of the 31st May of 1826, the same newspaper referred to the fate of the terrible Pasha of Thessaloniki and his collaboration with Ibrahim Pasha, emphasizing that, according to the information, I'm quoting, according to the information from the camp of Ibrahim Pasha, we learn about the arrival of the terrible Abu Labud Pasha, the monster who in 1823 tied the wife of Captain Tassos, it referred to Karatasso, the hero of the Nausa revolution, in a sack of snake, and whose atrocity laid waste Thessaloniki. He was sent, it is said, from Divani to oversee the execution of the Christian who fell into the hands of the Turks. References to the revolution in Macedonia begin to decline after 1824, justifiably, since the revolution of Macedonia solely was in recession. In the following years, occasional news about Macedonia appeared in the US newspapers, mainly concerning the fate of women and children who has been scattered in the slave market of the large urban center of the Ottoman Empire. However, pro-Greek committees in the United States, most notably the most vigorous one, the Boston, because continued to fight for the gathering of food, clothing, and money supplies. This was because despite the fact that the revolution in Macedonia has been drowned in blood, the struggle in southern Greece continued and survived all difficulties caused both by ruthless attack of the Turks, who viewed the Greek revolution as a mutiny of the oppressed Rayas, and the civil war that put in grave danger the survival of the struggle itself. It should also be noted that the civil strike of the Greeks tarnished the idealistic image with the Philhellenic committee painstakingly painted in the United States, as evidenced by articles and letters from those Americans who lived close to the Greek Civil War, such as the Greek revolutionaries Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe and military man Jonathan Beckman Miller. The latter now openly expressed their doubts about the possibility of the Greeks to establish an organized and well-governed state. Finally, the choice of monarchy and the regime of the modern Greek contributed decisively to the decline of the Philhellenic fever in the United States. The refutation of the liberal values which were reflected in the pre-revolutionary constitution and which has excited the American feelings finally led to their disappointment about their conclusion of the Greek struggle for independence. In conclusion, making a general assessment of the role of the American press in presenting the events of the Greek Revolution of 1821, it should be mentioned that the American press, in its majority, was a positive and ardent supporter of the Greek struggle. Of course, the Philhellenic committees played a key role in this positive attitude of the press in the United States, which has formed a strong pro-Greek attitude in the American society, in some cases forcing their newspapers themselves to align with the so-called popular feeling. It was no coincidence that the most powerful Philhellenic committees were established and reinforced in those states that during the American Revolution were the strongholds of the American revolutionaries. Special mention should be made of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where the Declaration of American Independence was also signed. Regarding the presentation of the event of the revolution in Macedonia, in the American press, it should be pointed out that there were only a small part of the general publication related to the Greek Revolution, mainly due to the lack of information. Nevertheless, as already mentioned, the atrocities and the massacres of the Turks in the central Macedonia occupied the American press, highlighting the barbaric character of the Turks and further stimulating the Philhellenic feeling on the other side of the Atlantic, emphasizing the birthright of the Greeks in freedom and democracy. It is therefore justified to conclude that the Greek Revolution in Macedonia did not only contribute to the success of the struggle in the southern Greece, as it delayed significant Ottoman forces which could have suppressed the revolution upon its emergence, but also the Macedonian sacrifice and blood contributed to the reinforcement of Philhellenism both in US and in Europe through the raising awareness of the public opinion among the states of the West toward the struggling Macedonians and their holy and justified cause. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Nikos. Actually, it's very interesting to see how the Greek file was spread around the USA because of these very active Greek Philhellenic committees in the other side of the Atlantic. It's also very interesting to see that the Greek War of Independence was, of course, as a priority, a war towards liberty and the war for national emancipation, but also it was presented as a holy war, as a war of Christians against Muslims. Just add a few words on the revolution in Macedonia. We have to know that the revolution in Macedonia was also designed by the Filiki Eteria, this secret association established in Odessa in 1814, and it was the key element for the organization of the Greek Revolution. And at the beginning, the Chalkidiki Peninsula, the town of Nausa in central Macedonia and the Mount Olympus had been chosen as the centers of the revolution in Macedonia. But we have to say also, and it was clear from your presentation, that the revolution in Macedonia was not very well organized. And although it was lasted for 1 year and a half, actually it failed for many reasons. And the main reason was that Macedonia was very close to the capital of the empire, Constantinople, and also Thessaloniki was the second biggest city of the empire and the biggest city in the Balkans. And thousands of Ottoman troops were settled there and were used by the Ottomans against the revolutionaries. But it was also true to say that the revolution in Macedonia helped facilitate the establishment of the revolution in the northern parts of the Greek peninsula, especially in Morea and Peloponnese. So thank you again, Nikos, and we are moving to our second speaker. I think it's Dimitrios Mitsopoulos, who is an MA student at Freie University of Berlin, and he was also a member and a researcher at the Research Center of the Society for Macedonian Studies in Thessaloniki. He will present how the French press reacted towards the revolution in Macedonia. Dimitrios, you have also 15 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Let me share my screen. First of all, thank you very much, and I would like to thank the Macedonian Society and Alexandra, and of course, Professor Michailidis for our collaboration for a couple of years. The Greek Revolution of 1821 was not influenced its contemporaries, as we saw already. It was a decisive event in the long chain of uprisings in the age of revolutions. Revolution, however, was not perceived only as an event of the time. A nation of factors and events, and enlightenment, in connection with the massacres of civilians, such as the ones in Chios or Sarah, caused a major Hellenic movement, which largely determined the fate of the revolution. Getting the news from the Balkan Peninsula to Paris, Vienna, and Berlin was not an easy task, and it was the work of the press of the time. In the context of the research on the press and the depiction of the revolution in Macedonia, I dealt with the French and the Austrian press of the time to the extent that they were digital online. On the contrary, the digitalization of the German press, when the research out, it was not possible to draw conclusions even primary ones. Not every search term was equally productive, as some of them, like the terms Macedonia and Greeks, did not lead to the present but to the ancient past. French and Austrian press broadcasted the news from the Greek area, but also from the international developments of the struggle. The way they conveyed the facts was directly related to the access they had, the positions they represented, the interests of their states, and their assessments of the course of the struggle. Already, since the outbreak of the revolution in Moldavia, the foreign press had been reporting on the uprising there, although the information that arrived were quite vague, at least during the first weeks. What is obvious from the very first days, however, is the negative attitude of the Austrian press. What stands out more broadly is that the French and Austrian press emphasized on military and diplomatic events, such as the siege of Tripoli and the negotiations for autonomy in St. Petersburg. But what seems to shock them is the fate of the civilians and the mass retaliations, such as those in Chios. The above tendency is even more characteristic in the Austrian press, which had been reluctant or negative about the revolution, but often refers to civilians and their fate. As is easily inferred from all the above, the revolution in Macedonia did not go unnoticed. Both the events themselves, as well as the geostrategic and economic interests of the Austrians and the French in connection with a strong French presence in Thessaloniki, created a strong interest in the development of the struggle in the region. The news about the course of the revolution in Macedonia started from the spring of 1821, reached their peak in 1922 and the beginning of 1823, and in fact they disappeared after 1825. The only information about the actions of the Ottoman government is that it will take revenge on the armed Greeks who resist, through the Greeks in its hands. This happened in Thessaloniki, the capital of Macedonia, where Pasha has expelled several Greeks and sentenced them to death. Fear has taken over the minds of many, and the only hope of the Christians is in the path of the guerrillas of Moria and Albania, when their course have already taken part in Fassel and Lars. All of Macedonia is said to be ready to shake off the Turkish yoke. This was the first news broadcasted by the French liberal newspaper Le Constitutionnel and concerns the revolution in Macedonia on June 23, 1821. A few days earlier, on June 18, 1908, the Austrian Leipziger Zeitung described the Ottoman retaliation in Thessaloniki, while at the same time accused Misolidis of trying to deceive the crowds with the supposed hope of Russian support. As it can be seen from the aforementioned dates, the news did not reach Central Europe immediately, but within a reasonable period of several weeks. Besides, the main source of information were the letters and the caravans which traveled from areas of the Ottoman Empire and carried the news, many times distorted or falsified. The news reached the newspapers either through the Ionian Islands or through Semlin, Nice, Trieste, and the monastir. It's characteristic that the newspapers themselves often report that a letter did not arrive from Thessaloniki, so that they do not have any news, or the caravans did not bring anything new. We can often observe inaccurate or false news published, mainly in the Austrian press, such as the news about the occupation of Thessaloniki by the revolutionaries, or estimates of the summer of 1822 that the revolution had reached its bitter end, as it was expected from the very beginning. Especially in the first year of the revolution, it is a common phenomenon, probably or rather due to incorrect estimates, wrong information, rumors, and largely the product of the long journey until they reach the newspapers, while they may be the result of a better strategy or expression of pious desires, such as the following. The fate of the Greeks is fiery cut and it's almost seemed to be destroyed. Most of the important ones, the high clergy and those who were characterized by wealth and talent, had already been killed by the Turks, and if nothing else happens, the expressed desire of the Ottomans to exterminate the Greeks for centuries will be fulfilled. The islanders of the archipelago were determined to emigrate to America in their numerous ships with women and children if their purpose failed. These unfortunates have no choice, since everything was destroyed and will be destroyed when Turkish rule is restored. Educational and rehabilitation activities in Macedonia, Moria, and Cyprus will never be restored under Turkish rule, and all surviving Greeks will submit to Turkish rulers as slaves. As for the French, the one that stands out is the newspaper Le Constitutionnel, Journal du Commerce Politique et Littéraire, which is the main source from which we were able to obtain information about the revolution in Macedonia. It was a newspaper characterized by liberal, anti-clerical, and Bonapartist ideas, and showed strong interest for the revolution from the very beginning. And it was very positive towards the revolution. The main interests of the Le Constitutionnel revolve around the central developments of the struggle, and especially the fate of the civilians. The newspaper provided information about the revolution discussed almost daily. The newspaper often draws its news from other references in the European press of the time. Its reports on the region are often accompanied by comments and news on the situation of the Franco-Levantine community in Thessaloniki and the French presence in the region, such as the reference to the movement of troops from Smyrna to Thessaloniki at the request of the councils in order to protect the foreign properties, as we can see here in the experts of the slide. On the other hand, the Austrian newspapers that mainly provide information on the situation in northern Greece are the Leipziger Zeitung and Klagenfurter Zeitung and the Österreichischer Beobachter. Austrian newspapers are basically quite concerned with the military developments and reactions of the Ottoman Empire and the retaliation against civilians. Leipziger Zeitung and the Klagenfurter Zeitung show interest in the actions of the rebels and often refer to their movements after their defeats and disbandments of their military corpses in Macedonia. They seem to know well the people involved in the revolution and their activities. They also often refer to the commercial activities in Macedonia and how they were influenced by the revolution. The following quote from the Leipziger Zeitung is an obvious example. According to the latest commercial letters from Thessaloniki, there was peace in Macedonia. There were no Greek warships in the bay, and the connection to the sea was therefore free. Trade, however, was completely reduced due to the uncertainty of the facts, and no speculations and agreements can be made. While the same newspaper on 19th January of 1925 reported the following. Through the passengers of a caravan, we learned that the situation in Thessaloniki is bearable, even though the trade has stopped completely, and few traces are reminiscent of the old developing city. As already mentioned, both in the French and Austrian press, violence against civilians is an important factor in the news of the time. Indicative are the descriptions of the massacres in Thessaloniki in the summer of 1822. The letters from Thessaloniki on August 23 announced that after the events of Cassandra, almost all of the Greek merchants of Thessaloniki were imprisoned by order of the Pasha. The Greek water was abandoned to the Turks and the Jews, who entered the churches, where they damaged and destroyed all the sacred objects and sold the gold and the silver cups, for which they were paid a certain amount of money from the Pasha. Then they exercised all their revenge against the Greeks. We even had fires in some streets. The Russian consul had previously taken refuge on a ship. The caravan that arrived in Belgrade brought many of the valuables stolen from the church of Thessaloniki to be sold. In the French press, we also find some frequent reports in smaller cities of Macedonia, such as Veri and Naus. The Pass of Thessaloniki completely exterminated the city of Nausea. 5,000 families were displaced due to the Turkish occupation. Zafirakis, the Greek leader, before leaving, ordered the women and children to be killed so that they would not be enslaved by the Turks. In Macedonia, the revolution is equally cruel with the islands. The Pass of Thessalonica exterminated completely the region of Nausea. 5,000 families had to leave the region because of Turkish atrocities. The above descriptions and images are defining points of the narratives. In addition to military and diplomatic events in the region, the newspaper vividly described the massacres. Victim numbers are often presented as exaggerated. These publications are decisive though, both as facts, but also in terms of how they are transmitted. As in the text, one can distinguish a strong religious dimension. Christianity is set opposed to Islam, but also many older Orientalistic depictions of the Ottoman Empire can be traced, as the Ottoman regular army sometimes is referred as Asian Hordes. Gender representations and the violence perpetrated against women and children is also an important issue, because most of the time the focus on women and children is presented in contrast with the bravery of the men. In the case of the bravery of the men, we can also trace many times references and to the ancient past, and the newspapers tried to find resemblances between the Greek fighters of revolution and ancient Greeks. To conclude, it can be said that the Austrian and French press saw a strong interest in the revolution in Macedonia, but also in relation to their interest and presence in the region, while the fate of the civilians, the Ottoman reactions, are key elements of their text. At the same time, these newspapers show us the connection of the region with other regions, either in Balkans or in the Ottoman Empire, based on the information networks, but also the importance of the revolution for its contemporaries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitrios. You gave us a different aspect of the issue. It is true that we have different representations of the Greek Revolution and the revolution in Macedonia for many reasons. One of them is the different political and diplomatic priorities of the great powers. It's not the same like if we speak on the case of USA and the case of France or Austria. It is also, let's say, a different perception of the people living in the area, both Christians and Muslims, a kind of Orientalism, as it was described. But certainly we have to know, we are at the beginning of the 18th century, and when we are reading newspapers, actually most or all of newspapers of the time, we can see through the lines a propaganda war, a war of misinformation, which is true, especially in the case of Macedonia. Actually, Macedonia was far from the European centers, and the news needed more than 2 months in order to be spread, to be transmitted through the diplomatic and consular channels from Macedonia to the rest of Europe. So thank you again, and we are moving to our last speaker, Alexandra Perkanido. Alexandra is also a researcher at the Research Center of Macedonian Studies, and she's an MA student at the Greek Hellenic University. Actually, she defended her dissertation, and she done it very well. So we have Alexandra, and she will focus on the British press. And go ahead, Alexandra, you have again 15 minutes for your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Professor. Allow me a moment to share my screen. Okay, so I would like to thank you all very much for this chance to shed light in the ways the British press preserved and presented the Greek Revolution in Macedonia to their audience. Most of the research was conducted through the digital repositories of the British newspapers, with special attention given to keywords such as Macedonian, Thessaloniki, written in some articles as Saloniki or Salonika. Additionally, it is important to keep in mind two decisive factors. The first concerned the way the news would arrive from different areas of Greece to Great Britain, and the other was the diplomatic standing of Great Britain had at the time the Greek Revolution had begun. Okay, let me see. Excuse me for a moment. Okay. Taking in consideration any possible inaccuracies of the events portrayed in the articles and the ways the events played out due to the circumstances of the time, the Greek Revolution in Macedonia, as seen by the British papers for the purpose of this presentation, was divided into two periods. From 1821 to 1824, tentatively placed due to the death of Lord Byron, and from 1824 till 1830, when most of the columnist attention was focused on the great powers and the resolution of the Greek question. Concerning the first period of 1821 to 1824, it should be borne in mind that the news, quote, of that time arrived in Great Britain with a delay of at least 2 to sometimes 3 months. However, the date of the letter or the report was written and sometimes was noted too. The methods of transportation was either by ship, usually from Thessaloniki and the Ionian Islands, or following the caravan routes from Eastern Europe and from there to different Austrian cities such as Vienna, as very well my colleague has also stated. There were also different transportation points in between. Therefore, we have a picture of the time which usually mediated from the writing and sending any information about the Greek Revolution to its publication in the British newspapers. At the same time, there was no exclusive, quote, source of the news, as the letters usually was posted on different newspapers, but on different dates, depending the day of publication. And in the times where there was no other mail with the supply ships, some newspapers would reproduce the same letter into their next issues, as you can see here from those two examples from the Morning Chronicle and the Caledonian Mercury. The first mention to a general project that the Greeks were planning for a revolt comes from the Morning Post. Macedonia is mentioned as one of the areas where the extent of the secret society such as Philiki Eteria has taken root, and also a small mention to the economic preparation for said revolt. The interest for the Greek Revolution in Macedonia was interwoven with economic representations of the Levant Company, one of the key ports of the Southeast Mediterranean and the principal port to the Balkans. Thessaloniki had a long urban history and one of the most varied societies in Europe. Thus, the port of the city held the interest of the British consul stationed there. In such an example of a consular letter published in The Guardian, it is described in a vivid way the situation in the city, the course of the Greek Revolution in the Isthmus of Cassandra, as also that most of the Ottoman troops were destined for the south in Moria, which then had to reroute in order to stop first Emmanuel Papa, the leader of the revolution in Chalkidiki. Most of the newspapers center on these events. Due to the short time the revolution in Macedonia took place and how swiftly it ended, it is hard to determine if there were enough correspondence between the few British merchants living in the city and the revolutionaries outside the city. Instead, the articles focus on what happens inside Thessaloniki. For example, Yusuf Bey, the commander of Thessaloniki, in retaliation, killed and imprisoned prominent members of the city's Greek community, and among the victims was also Metropolitan Kytros Meletios. Others were killed in the cathedral where they had fled for refuge, mostly women and children, and their heads were gathered together as a present to Yusuf Bey. It is a little cruel, the description. The Morning Chronicle gives also such an example. The extracts of letters, various reports, and smaller announcements centered on the specific events that picked the attention of the British newspapers rarely mentioned any names, and in some respects they exaggerated. The participation of the monks of Mount Athos in the revolution alongside Emmanuel Papa caused surprise and was presented extensively in almost a melodramatic way, as in this extract from The Guardian. When Emmanuel Papas had proclaimed the revolution in Carriers of Mount Athos and Polygyros Chalkidiki on May 1821, the British newspapers had already begun to narrate the chronicle of the Greek Revolution. They focused mainly to the area around Thessaloniki, rarely mentioned Naousa and Ceres. The revolution in Macedonia ended violently in October 1821 after the lost Battle of Cassandra, which led to the massacre of the population in the areas of Potidia, Cassandra, as also the surrounding villages of Thessaloniki. Specifically, the organized operations of the Greek revolutionaries in Chalkidiki did not last more than a month. Emmanuel Papas had at first the support of the monks of Mount Athos and the inhabitants of the areas of Cassandra, Polygyros, and Mademochoria. After the lost battle in Cassandra, won by Mehmet Emin Pasha, Emmanuel Papas faced the disapproval of Mount Athos since the Ottoman forces were also heading towards the monasteries. Some of the monks even came to the secret negotiations in order to betray Papas and surrender him to the Ottoman forces, mostly in order not to lose their privileges. Informed beforehand by the abbot Kyrillos of the Sigmen monastery, Papas escaped with few of his warriors, hoping to continue the Greek revolution in Peloponnese. Unfortunately, he died from a heart attack while on ship, and he was buried in the island of Hydra on the 5th December 1821. By March 1822, the British newspapers report that Macedonia is tranquilized and the power of the Porte is recognized. Mehmet Emin, who was known for his brutality, as also seen by the following articles, was also the one who ended the Greek Revolution in Chalkidiki, but also the revolt in Olympus and Vermion during March and April 1822, essentially ending any attempts for the deliverance of Macedonia from the Ottoman rule. For this specific revolt, we do have a report from the Morning Chronicle with a translation from the French papers, as also you can see this connection from French to British newspapers. The efforts of Nikolaos Kasomoulis, the local leader and a member of Philiki area, to find help in southern Greece were of little consequence. Shortly afterwards, they joined up with the Greek revolutionaries, who also had already mounted the uprising in Naousa, having taken up battle positions on 19th February of 1822. Despite the town's reserves of arms and ammunition, and despite the efforts of the Naousa notables Zafirakis Theodosiou and the captains Tassos Karatassos and Angelis Gatsos, Naousa was captured on the 30th of April by Mehmet Emin Pasha, whom at first had destroyed Veria on the 11th of April 1822. The numbers are not very specified. We have reports of 2,000 Christians that were slaughtered, while most were surviving rebel leaders left to continue the fight in southern Greece. The destruction of Naousa marked the end of the Greek Revolution in Macedonia in 1822. The newspapers pointed a dramatic picture of the violence and the fate of the Greeks. The Guardian, as you can see here, and the next article in the Morning Chronicle are some of these examples. Here, people either choose suicide over enslavement or have their freedom bought by the Greeks of Thessaloniki. By the end of 1823, there are very few reports or any letters referring to any revolutionary activities across Macedonia, with some mentioning only the piracy and the subtle naval skirmishes of the Northern Aegean and the Thermaic Gulf, unseen here on the Lancaster Gazette. The second period of 1824 till 1830, as seen by the newspapers of Great Britain, contains rare mentions of Macedonia. The political turmoil caused the Greek Revolution breaking out in 1821 affected deeply Thessaloniki's economy, as in many other areas of the Ottoman Empire. Commerce was brought to a standstill and transports were hindered, forcing many international operators to transfer capital and expertise elsewhere. The pirate-held island of Thassos would be featured rarely in comparison to Thessaloniki, and here there are some very scant reports of the movements as seen in the Lancaster Gazette. Apart from the growing interest of the great powers of the revolution was the article posted, as we see here on Derby Mercury, on the 19th of May 1824 that caused an uproar. The newspaper posted the announcement of Lord Byron's death, along with an explanation of how he died, and that's all came also a letter written and translated to English by Alexandros Misolidis. The letter arrived with a delay of 1 month to Great Britain, and both the dates of his death and the publication of the newspaper are very accurate. As for Macedonia, the Guardian refers to the general unrest of the Ottoman Empire, and Thessaloniki is also mentioned as part of a failed attempt of the Ottomans to attack the island of Skiathos in Sporades. Members of his fleet had been recruited from the areas of Naousa, Cassandria, and Macedonia, and he returned to the city defeated. 2 years later, the Morning Post would refer to Macedonia as a transit point where ammunition would be transferred to the, quote, theater of war in Mourian Mesologi. The Standard, in 1827, simply refers to instances of piracy outside the city from the Gulf of Volos till the Thermaic Gulf. The same newspaper, in 1828, mentioned the expedition of Ypsilanti to Thessaly, which per the report's opinion was received by the inhabitants of Thessaloniki as a favourable to their own course, but there were no further reports of this matter. Macedonia and Thessaloniki become again part of the British newspapers' articles with the Russo-Turkish War of 1828-1829, which came as a result of the Russian Empire's participation in the naval battle of Navarino. War broke out after the Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II closed the Dardanelles to Russian ships and revoked the 1826 Ackermann Convention in retaliation. The Russians then led prolonged sieges to the 3 key Ottoman citadels in today's Bulgaria. Specifically, the siege of Sumla proved much more problematic. Sumla was mentioned by the Standard and the Jackson's Oxford Journal, as we see here, as the Ottomans fell victims of war and disease, and there is a theory that the circumstances would again be favorable for a new revolt in Macedonia. The Russo-Turkish War ended with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the signing of the Treaty of Adrianople in September 24, 1829. The favorable position of the Russian Empire gained after the war could lead to a resolution of the Greek struggle with the creation of a satellite state close to the interest of the Russian Empire. That led to Great Britain and the other great powers to take a more dynamic approach to the matter. Thus began a new round of negotiations that would culminate following the English proposal in the Protocol of Independence, with I give the 2 different dates for the old and the new diary, 22nd of January, 3rd February 1830, which would be accepted by the Sultan. A rare example of the reaction of the signing of the protocol cost can be found in the Times. The date mentioned of the report comes 1 month after the issue's publication and refers to the reactions of the Allied powers in the Porte in regards to this matter. The Greek Revolution in Macedonia may have ended in failure, but not before gaining an important advantage that helped the Greek cause in southern Greece. The delay of the dispatch of the Ottoman troops, as also shown and stated many times by the papers, as the Turkish troops had first to deal with the revolt in Macedonia, despite its failure, kept the audience of the Great Britain interested, but not on the battles per se, instead on the atrocities and the struggles the people suffered on the hands of the Ottomans, something which in later articles in the newspapers following 1824 and after led to characterize the Ottomans as, quote, barbarians, and the Greeks who fought heroically as, quote, descendants of Pericles and Leonidas. Knowing that the newspapers followed the events of the time and the way in which they were broadcasted may not have been surrounded by due objectivity, they offer an interesting perspective on the way the Greek Revolution was fought. The vivid descriptions of the lost battles, the emotion carried from within each written report and article is by far different from today's method of journalism. These newspapers wanted to evoke emotion, and as support towards the Greek cause rose, they also painted the Ottomans as, quote, villains and, quote, oppressors of the descendants of Homer and King Philip. A combined effort of both journalism and historical research could offer even more insight to this unique perspective of the Greek Revolution as seen from foreign newspapers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you indeed, Alexandra. You made us clear that comparing to some other parts of the Greek peninsula, like the Peloponnese and Sterea Elada or the islands, the events in Macedonia did not attract the same interest by the European press. And this, of course, it was a pity, but it was also a reality. For example, the massacre in the town of Nausa, the well-known Holocaustoma, although it was like the same, like the massacre in Chios or the Messaloniki affair. And we have just a few sentences in specific European and USA newspapers, and I must say that these lines are actually not accurate, and they fail to describe the tragic fate of the native population in the area of Nausa and in the whole Macedonia, of course. And of course, this was happened because Macedonia was far from the main European centers of information. Very few, actually at this time, very few European Philhellenes came in Macedonia, and they failed to transmit the news from Macedonia to the native, to the rest of Europe. But this is another story, and probably we have the time to discuss it during the next stage of our today's webinar. And probably I have to give the room to Panos.
Yes, indeed. Actually, we can discuss some of the questions. Allow me to ask actually the participants to submit their questions through the Q&A session. Let me read actually the first one, which is quite, it's related to what you have mentioned before. So, what were the main uprisings in the region of Macedonia during 1821 and the following years, and why they have failed, at least initially? So you mentioned Nausa, Chios, Messaloniki, Chalkidiki, but can you summarize the main uprisings and the reasons? Were there different reasons on each?
Okay. Thank you, Panos. Yes, you have to say that the Greek Revolution, it was designed by Philikieteria, and we have different plans of documents of Philikieteria, and these plans were revised and revised again because of the difficulties of the time. But we can say that as Peloponnese, Sterea Lava, and the three islands, especially Hydra and Spetses, had been chosen by the leaders of Philikieteria as the centers of the Greek Revolution. But according to the same plans by the Philikieteria, revolutionary movements had to be immersed in different parts of the Greek peninsula and in the whole areas where unredeemed Greeks were living for centuries, and Macedonia was also one of these places. The problem in Macedonia, actually there are many problems. The first one, and probably the most important, that Macedonia was in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and it was very easy for the Ottomans to send directly troops there and to stop any revolutionist movement. But at the same time, we have to say that the Macedonian members of Philikieteria at the time of the revolution were not in the Macedonia. Most of them were in the closer friends of Alexandros Misolidis. They were following him, and it was impossible for them to come directly down to Macedonia and to organize the revolution in Macedonia. That's why, although they had chosen three places, Chalkidiki Peninsula, the town of Nausa, and Mount Olympus, for revolutionary centers, and according to the plans, revolution in Macedonia started almost some weeks after the revolution in southern Greece in May 1821, but according to the original plan, they had to start simultaneously. But because of the lack of information and the very bad organization, the network of the Macedonian revolutionaries in the area was very bad organized. It was very difficult for them to start together. That's why when Chalkidiki started, Naousa and the rest of Macedonia remained calm. So it was easy for the Ottomans to send directly the troops against the revolution in Chalkidiki. They did it, and they stopped the revolution there. And Naousa started some months after, at the beginning of 1822, and it was very easy for the Ottomans to stop any movement there, and they also did it. And then for Mount Olympus, it was, let's say, a very small movement, and just lasted for 2-3 days because they had received the news for what happened in the rest of Macedonia, and so they decided to abandon the area. So it was a combination of difficulties in the area because it was close to the center of the empire, but it was also a problem of lack of fighters to work together and to start and to achieve anything in Macedonia. That's why after 1 year and a half, we have thousands of refugees from Macedonia, and these people were moving towards the rest of the Greek peninsula, and we can find a lot of them in Morea, in Messaloniki. Actually, if you can visit the area of Atalante in Sterea Elada, you can see there is a village there called Macedonia, and these settlers were coming from Macedonia after the fall of Naousa. These were the main reasons for the case of Macedonia. But on the other hand, we have to say that the revolution in Macedonia sold to the rest of the world, and of course to the Ottomans also, that there was a common dream uniting the whole Hellenism. Either it was easier for them to move, like the people in Morea and Sterea Elada. Either they faced a lot of difficulties, like the Macedonians, who had to wait for at least 100 years more in order to be liberated.
Perhaps a follow-up question on that. So during the period from 1821 to 1912, let's say, were there any other movements actually or uprisings in that region, or was it really a matter of regrouping, as you said, by population migrating actually to the south?
It's a good question to ask my students also, actually, but I don't know if they want to comment anything on that. Of course, we had the second phase after the revolution in 1821, 1822. It was during the Crimean War in 1854. We have a lot of movements in the area of Macedonia. They failed, of course, but they were in the same channel, in the same steps, and the fighters were also the same, because it was this generation coming from the Greek Revolution of 1821. And the next phase, the third stage towards the liberation of Macedonia, it was during the Eastern question in 1878 after the Treaty of San Stefan, who for a while, for a couple of months, designed a greater Bulgaria. This was a great fear for the Greek Macedonians, and they took the arms again, and they started to find both the Turks and the Bulgarians. And of course, the important in that third stage, it was that the British policy started to change, and from a phase of neutrality to remain stable, the Ottoman Empire, this was the British policy till the end of 19th century. They started to face a different, let's say, consequences in the area, and to work for a greater Greece. And this followed during the next decades till the beginning of the 20th century, till the end of the First World War, till the catastrophe of the Greek army in Asia Minor.
Mm-hmm. I think in the interest of time, we should really stop here. So on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Macedonian Society of Great Britain and myself personally, a great thank you for making this event actually happen. So Professor Michailidis or Iakovos, Alexandra, Dimitri, Nico, it was a pleasure to have you all. I hope that now that the COVID-19 rules are being slowly relaxed in Europe, at least, we will have the chance to invite you here in London for another event, perhaps at the Hellenic Center or elsewhere in London, and physically meet you also in person as well. So finally, a great thank you to our audience for attending, and we hope to see you soon, all of you, in our next webinar. It's going to be on the 11th of June this year, where we will have the opportunity to visit virtually the new Museum of Aegeis. So Ms. Angeliki Kotaridi and Professor Elaine Fox will present the new Museum of Aegeis, and cover new findings, discoveries, as well as the historical aspects. So we wish you well and have a good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Panos.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.